If I were czar of the world or something like that, the first thing I would do would be to shut down nuclear power except for research. I think you just have to come to the conclusion that sooner or later these wastes are going to come back and bite the human race if it happens to be around at that time. You know, how can you justify doing some of these things when you don't really know what the consequences are going to be?
This bright, good-looking group of young men and women are the millennials in nuclear group. This is the brain trust. They're going to make nuclear energy cool again.
More countries are going big on the development of small modular reactors touted as the next generation of nuclear power.
SMRs are built to be durable and reliable. They are designed to shut down and cool autonomously and can be built mostly below ground.
So what we're seeing nationwide is essentially a nuclear renaissance. So many of the environmental groups have now come out in favor of nuclear power because of its environmental qualities, which is interesting.
It's amazing to me to watch this propaganda happening all over again. There's never going to be any failures and there's never going to be any problem. All you got to do is let us build one.
There's less of that fear of nuclear and more of sort of a need to use everything in our toolbox.
So we often hear this claim that the climate crisis is so grave that we have to throw everything that we have at it.
We have to throw all we can at this problem. It's a really big problem.
The question of what should be done with nuclear waste has been one forever characterized by deceit. They're going to pretend to have solutions, and then their solution is to give it to our grandchildren.
The existing laws and the restrictions on developing nuclear energy, there's, a sense of we don't need to work on that. It's not a threat here. And I think that's probably going to change in the years to come.
America is back in the nuclear energy industry, folks. We are back.
Safe, simple, secure, reliable energy anywhere. That is ultra safe.
Nuclear power has this great ability to not just portray itself as a modern technology, which is kind of odd because the technology is at least as old as the Manhattan Project is. And most of these reactors really are not that significantly different from those early reactors. But it has had this ability to dress itself up as very modern technology. The new scale design prominent in the Pacific Northwest is essentially a scaled-down light water reactor design. That's light water reactors are the most common kind of reactors around the world, especially in the United States.
Nuclear reactors depend on water for a cooling source, and the Columbia River, with its cold, clear water, has for many years been very attractive to nuclear development. And the small modular nuclear reactors, they've been repackaged by the nuclear power industry to make them sound small and simple and not dangerous. The nuclear power industry is a powerful lobby, and the climate crisis is a crisis. And so the combination of factors has unfortunately led some elected leaders to get on board with nuclear power. And so in the case of this proposed SMR facility along the Columbia River in Oregon, there's been a ballot measure in place for many years that prevents the development of new nuclear energy, and it's very much a threat right now.
Entire families came to mark the passing of the last nuclear waste shipment from France.
One thing we see around the world is that whenever nuclear projects are proposed, there automatically springs a movement which is opposing this, especially after the 1980s. 1970s, 1980s were the coming of age, as it were, of the nuclear industry, as well as knowledge about the problems that this industry posed. And so you've seen this around the world. And in many cases, these have been successful, not so much in shutting down specific projects, but in shutting down plans for much larger expansions. So if you look at the United States, for example, in the mid-1970s, they were expecting that there would be like 1,000 nuclear reactors built by the turn of the century, by the year 2000. In actual fact, it was more like 100.
The Trojan nuclear power plant is located northwest of Portland, about 40 miles downstream. The legacy of activism around the Trojan nuclear power plant is critical for people to learn from today because, shockingly, here in the Pacific Northwest, we now have proposals for new nuclear energy facilities. We can take lessons from Trojan and bring it into the fight to stop the development of small modular nuclear reactors, or SMRs.
August 8, 1977, 82 protesters arrested at Trojan plant. That was a seminal event. Lawyers for the activists managed to have a mass trial, and in return for not having 82 separate jury trials in little Columbia County, the DA agreed that they could have one trial and they could put on evidence for choice of evils, saying that nuclear power was so dangerous that what they were doing was justified in order to try and fight nuclear power.
The men were taken by bus to Portland. The women put aboard another bus and brought here to St. Helens. They arrived at the jail just as they had at the Trojan site, singing and chanting. From behind bars at the Columbia County Jail, Margot Fager described the arrest.
We were being asked to leave, that anyone who did not leave the PGE grounds, including the recreational area, this on the road, whatever, would be arrested.
The people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated. The people united.
In the mid-1980s, Lloyd told me that he wanted to go after Trojan. And my first thought was, you're nuts. This plant is operating, it's making money, it has massive resources, it has massive political support. It's crazy.
There's a great quote from the Oregon Department of Energy. They were the regulators, and they said, from the outset, the plant was plagued by design flaws and other problems that led to temporary closures and expensive repairs. And throughout the operating history of Trojan, that's exactly what occurred. They discovered that the control room building was not earthquake resistant, that the walls of the building had been designed by an engineer who had never designed a wall in his life up until that point. You know, my first involvement in trying to do something about this threat to our community was to spend time petitioning on the streets of Portland. But I also was going to public hearings.
All we're asking is that you hold a proceeding to examine the evidence, and that proceeding have the power to give the individuals who participate an opportunity to test and weigh that evidence.
Dan Meek and Lloyd Marbett are saying, we told you so.
The amount that PGE may have to spend on replacement steam generators could easily be greater than the original cost of building the plants. They're saying, let's put into a deferred account and then charge the ratepayers later even a larger amount of money, because it's costing more to re-sleeve and to plug the tubes at Trojan than they expected.
You needed to show before you did civil disobedience that you had tried all other alternatives first. By the time we got to 1992, all those efforts had failed, and that's what led to going to the gates of Trojan.
As the plant general manager's representative, I am ordering you to leave Portland General Electric property immediately, or you will be subject to arrest for trespassing. Do you understand? Do you choose to leave? I've been authorized by the plant general manager to have you arrested for trespassing on Portland General Electric property.
Close Trojan down! Close Trojan down!
my job as a nurse. You know, check the Oregon Nurse Practice Act. It says protect the public health of the community.
Okay. Anything you want to say before they take you? He'll be back. Right on.
When the tower came down, that was a celebratory moment because we were going to back them over a cliff no matter how long it took, and they recognized that.
All nuclear reactors, when the nuclear industry started, used to be small. And they became larger and larger over a period of time because nuclear power, because of this complicated way by which you're producing the energy and the electricity, is an expensive process. And the only way the nuclear industry could figure out how to reduce costs was to go to larger reactors. SMR developers basically promised that they have learned the lessons from earlier rounds of nuclear construction building and have solved everything. There are sort of 4 sets of problems that people talk about when they think about nuclear power. Building a nuclear reactor is going to be expensive. The whole promise of small modular reactors, when you come down to smaller sizes, the cost automatically goes up. The economies of scale that you gain by going to larger sizes are lost when you come back to smaller sizes. Smaller reactors tend to be more expensive per unit of electricity capacity or energy generated. And that means that you're going to lose out on the economic challenge that is confronting nuclear power. There is a company called Lazard, which is a Wall Street company that comes up with estimates of costs of electricity generated from different kinds of sources. The last report from Lazard that came out in 2021 estimated a new nuclear power plant would produce electricity at roughly $160 per megawatt hour. In comparison, the costs for solar and wind are of the order of $30 to $40 per megawatt hour. That's a huge gap. And if you go to small modular reactors, that gap will only become larger, right? And if large nuclear plants themselves are not competitive, there's no way that small modular reactors are going to be economically competitive.
Yeah, so what we've done is we have a reactor vessel, which is inside a containment vessel. But the secret is that it's all built in a factory. And then separately, you're doing your civil construction on site. So it's a parallel construction approach that greatly reduces schedule and cost.
In the case of small modular reactors, these new reactors that they're talking about, none of these designs are actually set in stone yet. They're all still evolving. So if you don't know exactly what your design is going to be, how do you build a factory to manufacture the parts for that?
They gathered before dawn at 3 Mile Island, marking the moment when one of 2 reactors went into partial meltdown, the worst nuclear accident in U.S. history, halting the growth of nuclear power in America to this day, and sparking health concerns that linger 40 years later.
The cleanup will take years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars.
It was just panic, it was fear, it was all these emotions wrapped up into one.
Thousands of pregnant women and families with toddlers like Christine Lehman's evacuated. 2 weeks later, they got an all clear from regulators and the utility company.
The second problem is that sometimes these can have accidents, like what happened in Chernobyl or in Fukushima, or in parts of the United States as well, 3 Mile Island, for example. And that can lead to the spreading of radioactive contamination over space, and that lasts for a very long time. They're always going to be living with this constant risk that someday what happened in Fukushima could happen to them as well, in which case they will all have to leave their houses and never probably come back to those houses. So there are all these areas which are often far away from the sight of the people, and the decisions for these things are not made necessarily by the people who are going to pay these costs. They're going to be made in state capitals and in national capitals, which are far away from these places. And the people who are investing in these are also living far away. They live in, New York and other banking areas. And so they are not going to be the people who are going to be affected by this. But it's common people who are living near any of these facilities that are going to pay the price.
This is a large-scale gas centrifuge enrichment plant, and we're here as IAEA inspectors. We're here to safeguard all the nuclear material. The IAEA inspectors play a crucial role because we directly contribute to verification activities. And through this, we can provide credible assurances that states are honoring their international obligations to use nuclear material for only peaceful purposes.
The third problem is that linkage between nuclear power and the capacity to make nuclear weapons materials. All nuclear reactors produce plutonium. Many of these use enriched uranium. The same technology that can enrich uranium, so-called centrifuges, can also make uranium that's enriched enough to be used in weapons. And the last is that all nuclear power plants produce radioactive waste that are hazardous to human health and the environment for tens of thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, even without accidents. So that's a necessary problem that you'll have to deal with. And so far, there is no demonstrated way of dealing with these over the periods of time that would be required to ensure safe management of these. And all of these are going to be present in the case of small modular reactors as well. If you look at trying to solve all of them, it's almost impossible to find a design that would optimize all of them.
This is fundamentally the coolest thing that we could be doing with our lives. It's potentially world-changing.
The nuclear industry is extremely strong. It has a very good PR machinery that is very convincing to a lot of people who see the climate crisis as being very threatening and not a lot of hope.
We must unite as one, join voices loud and strong, for the earth and future generations. Now's our last chance to take a stand. Come on, we can. Come on, we can.
The Columbia River is one of the most important estuaries on planet Earth. Every single salmon that goes up and down the Columbia River spends time in the estuary. It's the lifeblood of the Pacific Northwest. What's critical to remember is that the nuclear power industry in the United States has yet to solve the ultimate puzzle, which is what to do with nuclear waste. So for the proposed SMR near the Columbia River, what we're looking at right now is taking an approach similar to the toxic waste on site at the Trojan power plant. which is to leave the waste in what are called dry casks near the Columbia River, potentially into perpetuity. The reality is that when you look at the timelines associated with nuclear waste, the risk of a catastrophic earthquake is very real in that area. The risk of flooding, in fact, is significant. The environmental movement needs to be focused on a pathway through renewables, through energy efficiency, through conservation that does not require more salmon and steelhead extinctions on the Columbia River, and that does not require leaving our children and our children's children and beyond with generations of radioactive and toxic waste along the Columbia shores.
They wanted to do something that was very unusual in decommissioning a nuclear power plant. They wanted to immediately begin removing components in the nuclear power plant and disposing of them permanently. And they proposed to do what was called large component removal. They proposed to take the steam generators out of the nuclear plant, put them on a barge them up the Columbia River to Hanford, fill them with concrete, and throw them in the ground. That's what they did. They need some place to eventually dispose of this material, and of course, most of it goes into the ground.
We will always be here. We need to keep that in our heart. We need to know that every time we look into the eyes of a child, it is our responsibility to protect them and make this world better for them. Well, you have to understand that as far as nuclear power goes, the Hanford site, even with the cleanup, is the stake in the ground for the nuclear power industry, because we know it's going to be there for 100,000 years. So it's kind of a win-win situation for the powers that be to develop more, to try to, revive the industry, if you will.
Hanford is a particularly historical site because it was the place where the first nuclear reactors were built. And they were built to produce plutonium that was used in the weapon that was dropped over Nagasaki, and then subsequently hundreds and hundreds of other nuclear weapons.
In 1959, construction was started on a dual-purpose reactor to make plutonium for defense and steam for the generation of electricity. With the reactor building completed in 1963, the late President John F. Kennedy arrived at Hanford to break ground for the construction of the power plant.
And I think it's very appropriate that we come here, where so much has been done to build the military strength of the United States, and to find a chance to strike a blow for peace, and to find a chance to strike a blow for a better life for our fellow citizens. This is a great national asset here. I can assure you it will be maintained. And from the work we begin today, I hope the light will spread out, not merely to those who are served by electricity, but to all the world to realize that here in the United States, we're moving ahead and providing security for our people, and also a hope for a better life in this most beautiful country of ours. Thank you.
We had already seen the use of nuclear energy to explode a tremendous weapon. We saw that in Japan and in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that gave birth eventually, with a great deal of manipulation, to the use of nuclear energy to basically boil water to turn turbines to, create electricity.
Fantasyland, the happiest kingdom of them all. Presenting this week,
the atom is our future. It is a subject everyone wants to understand. And here to tell you the story of our friend the atom is the author of our book, Dr. Heinz Haber.
As we developed our story of the atom, we made an amazing discovery. We had a science story, but suddenly we realized that it was almost like a fairy tale. The world was deeply shocked by the first atomic explosion. We all wondered if atomic energy had better remained a secret forever. We are like the fisherman. When he first beheld the frightful form of the genie, he too wished that he had never found the vessel.
Oh, that presently thou wilt have to die.
But our fable had a happy ending. The fisherman had his means of making a friend of his enemy. And fortunately, science has its way of doing the same thing. An atomic blast is more than a threat. It is also a regretful waste of heat and radiation. To make this energy useful, the explosion must be slowed down.
The desert of southeastern Washington is home to the most contaminated area in the United States. Site workers are now engaged in the world's largest environmental cleanup project. Leaks from the tanks, along with hundreds of billions of gallons of radioactive and hazardous liquid waste that was dumped into the soil at Hanford, have contaminated about 80 square miles of groundwater beneath the site. Some of the contamination is entering the Columbia River. The remaining cleanup at Hanford will take decades and cost tens of billions of dollars. But it's the price that must be paid to protect current and future generations from Hanford's waste.
The Hanford nuclear site, which was targeted for the development of a permanent long-term repository for nuclear waste, is off the drawing table, and the mission at Hanford is cleanup. And so incredible activism from tribal nations as well as activists across the Pacific Northwest shut down efforts to turn Hanford into a national nuclear waste repository. The Confederated Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation, which has ceded lands in the area, has already come out to the U.S. Department of Energy expressing its opposition to SMR siting near Hanford, that the mission of the U.S. government must be laser focused on Hanford cleanup.
Russell Jim was a leader from the Yakama Nation who was the first person to put the issue of nuclear waste and an opposition to it from the First Nations into Washington, and eventually led the proposal to try and bury radioactive waste in Hanford to be canceled.
The Hanford area was our wintering ground. The winters were milder here, and so therefore we moved here and dispersed to all other parts of the country when spring came. So consequently, in the Treaty of 1855, we included such language, and it was accepted by the United States of America. And we would forever have the right to utilize the natural foods and medicines and to hunt and fish in all usual and accustomed places. With the coming of the Manhattan Project, put it in writing that the area had the abundant cold water, clean water that they needed to cool their reactors. The area was an isolated wasteland, and the people were expendable. And everyone was moved out, including the Yakama Nation people.
True progress at Hanford looks like a Columbia where people can catch locally caught fish and eat it without fear of getting sick. People can, downstream from Hanford, drink Columbia River water, swim in the river, recreate. It really is this question of, we've been able to keep the pollution at bay to a point where the Columbia remains the lifeblood of the Pacific Northwest. But unless we see through that cleanup, there are no guarantees that the Columbia will remain a river that is really for everyone.
Hanford Science Forum is an educational feature of the General Electric Company and the United States Atomic Energy Commission at Hanford.
The companies that were involved in Hanford construction all went on to also being part of the nuclear industry more largely.
We do have clams present in the Columbia River. Clams were once used in the Columbia by Indians. We have two different kinds of fish, the small bullhead, which lays in wait at the bottom of the river to capture other fish which may swim by. And of course, a couple of very small specimens of the sturgeon, which is the largest fish in the Columbia. The work in the Columbia River is this, the results are this. We do find that these fish pick up very small amounts of radioactive materials. The amount which they pick up is not at all hazardous. So we know that from this angle, the operation of the plant is quite safe. Similar programs are also carried on by other components for the atmosphere, for the soil, for the drinking water. This are part of the safety program which ensures that the environs of the Hanford Works are maintained in a very safe manner.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Mass public deception continued on until 1986 that don't worry, everything's fine. If we continue to eat the fish from the Columbia, especially around the Hanford area, as we have in the past. Battelle says they have scientific studies on the river, and they say everything's fine. If so, then how come EPA came out with a study that says there is 1 chance in 50 of getting cancer from very contaminated salmon and fish?
We talk about the oil. We can't forget about the nuclear, the small modular nuclear reactors that are being developed right across the river and backed by some of the biggest billionaires in the country.
The next miracle, these are ores so far, is nuclear energy. The Gen 4, whoever's Gen 4 gets built, will be a no human required, no zirconium turning into hydrogen to explode type design.
If everything goes perfectly.
Absolutely.
How often does everything go perfectly?
In nuclear? If you ignore... No, come on. If you ignore 1979 and 1986 and 2011, come on, we've had a good century. No, seriously, in terms of raw figures,
Now, if you look at Bill Gates' wealth, he can definitely fund that whole thing by himself, right? But he doesn't do that. He gives maybe a few $1 million, maybe tens of millions of dollars into that. And then he goes to Washington, he goes to Beijing and tries to get public money for that, right? That's kind of the proof of why, even these billionaires and these investors who think that nuclear power has a promising future don't want to put their own money in it, right? What does that tell you? And that, I think, tells you something about how they operate.
You have these little public utility districts throughout Washington, and they think, oh, we're gonna catch the wave, we're gonna catch the future, we're gonna go nuclear. And so they gave everything to the industry that the industry wanted. And one of the things was cost plus contracts, so that no matter how many mistakes the construction companies made, they'd make more money each time they screwed up.
It's not just Hanford, it's all of the Department of Energy contracts have that same incentive in them. The WIP, the Waste Isolation Project.
Which has a plutonium leak also.
Which had a plutonium explosion also. In the months before that, all the executives walked away with bonuses despite the fact that there were numerous safety problems.
The Bill Gates company, TerraPower, they're kind of moved to a different design now. And this design is essentially an old design, a sodium-cooled fast reactor design, which they have modernized in some fashion. And we don't know enough about it, but of course, you're not going to make a telephone the same way you made it 50 years ago, but that doesn't change some of the fundamental features of this particular nuclear reactor design.
Molten salt reactors for the production of electrical power were studied at Oak Ridge National Laboratory from 1957 to 1960. Design studies and technological developments strongly indicated that molten salt breeder reactors operating on a thorium cycle could be developed to produce low-cost electricity and conserve our uranium resources. The molten salt reactor experiment went critical on June 1st, 1965. As a result of this success, ORNL is proposing to develop a thermal breeder reactor. Thermal breeders have many practical construction and operating advantages, and the molten salt reactor appears to be a very attractive thermal breeder. Molten salt thermal breeders should have a low inventory of fissional material, which means that the amount of uranium needed to fuel the reactor is low. In the design of a
One should remember that waste is not just one kind of thing. We categorize the waste into multiple streams depending on the kind of radioactivity, how long it is going to be radioactive, and are there certain specific materials that are particularly hard to deal with, and so on. Some of these reactor designs, they involve the use of materials that are very difficult to deal with. For example, molten sodium. This is, for example, the design that Bill Gates' company TerraPower is promoting, natrium. Or they might use things like molten salts, which are again difficult to deal with because of their chemical properties, not just the radioactive aspect of it.
Once it's time to dispose of it. In the US, there is still no national geologic repository for nuclear waste. And so it is then hundreds of thousands of years that waste, this radioactive toxic waste, will exist near the Columbia River, relatively close to communities, and threaten not only people's health, but also the Columbia River.
You had a slide that showed, I think, 17,600 acres for a 60 megawatt wind farm, while talking about just 34 acres for 60 megawatt per module small nuclear reactor, right? Why would we do wind?
Can renewables and nuclear be friends? Thanks for your question, yeah.
The nuclear industry pitches small modular reactors and nuclear power more generally as a complement to renewables. They don't dismiss renewables. They say we need renewables, but we also need nuclear power.
The stored heat allows the natrium system to be uniquely flexible. It can rapidly ramp electricity production up or down based on demand or the availability of renewable sources. The natrium technology...
There are two problems with that. The first, as I mentioned, is that nuclear power is already very expensive. And when the wind is blowing hard or when the sun is shining, you would lower the output, maybe bring it all the way down to zero. And then when the power dies down from the renewable sources, you would ramp up the nuclear power plant. Now, this is technically challenging for any nuclear plant because they like to operate at a more or less constant output level, what is usually called baseload mode of operation. But more important, coming back to the question of economics, is that when you operate a nuclear plant in that kind of fashion where the output goes up and down, you're necessarily generating less than the maximum amount of power that you'll be producing. So the cost that you have spent on the reactor would have to be recouped over fewer kilowatt hours of electricity. In other words, the cost per unit is going to go up. Every utility in the United States that owns a nuclear plant also owns fossil fuel assets, right? It could be coal, it could be oil, it could be natural gas, or some combination of all of them, right? All of them don't want to see very rapid climate action because then that would mean they have to shut down a whole bunch of fossil fuel plants, right? So they want to pretend that they are interested in solving the problem while also maintaining their current sources of wealth.
Let's see how bright the future can be when cleaner, safer energy is available to all. NuScale, power to the world, power for all humankind.
Climate change is the problem of problems. And again, here, nuclear power could be a plausible way forward. Nuclear power is getting smaller, safer, and more energy efficient by the day, which only strengthens what I think is now a very reasonable argument that you should consider. The world needs more nuclear power, and it needs it right now. Today's video was made in conjunction with the United States Department of Energy and Idaho National Laboratory.
Talking to America and literally talking to the world about why the nuclear industry is so important to our future.
They're looking for huge amounts of support from the government, and that requires a huge amount of propaganda to people to try and call their congressmen and say, why aren't you funding this new beautiful solution to our climate crisis? And then hope that all these people in Washington are going to get the funding that they want. I think that the SMR push, and more largely the push for nuclear power as a solution to climate change, is going to get us the worst of both worlds. It's not going to solve climate change. When these things are going to be deployed, some of them will have accidents. All of them will produce waste, which will have to be dealt with. Some of them could contribute to nuclear weapons proliferation, and we will be spending a huge amount of money that could have been spent on other things. It's a lose-lose proposition, as it were.
The Columbia River is often referred to as a workhorse. This river is one that has been transformed in the last century into the generator of energy for the Pacific Northwest. And at the same time, it has stolen from so many people, from tribal governments, the rights to, catch salmon, steelhead, the rights that were promised by the US government.
The whole emphasis on nuclear power becomes a distraction. There's an opportunity cost in wasting this money, in wasting all these very intelligent people, wasting their energy and their talents, essentially. We just have to reduce the emissions. And the second is we need to do it really fast, because the timeline that the IPCC and other scientists tell us is very soon, right? They want you to reduce it by 50% by 2030 and essentially bring it down to zero by 2050. There is almost no chance that small modular reactors are going to contribute anything in this time frame. And in fact, the fact that you're spending money and time on that means that you're actually setting back the clock on trying to reduce emissions. We have to change the system fundamentally. By the system, I mean our social systems, our economic systems, the way we produce things, the way we move around, the way we get our food. All of those things are going to contribute. And that's a very big problem. And in a way, people kind of latch on to straws which tell them that, just use this technology and magically just replace all your coal plants with nuclear plants and all your problems are going to go away. And of course, for people who are in positions of power, who are disproportionately benefiting from the current system, the economic system, the political system, that is a great message to be sending out, because then their privilege is not challenged in any way.
It's a very thin green line that we're standing on. And we in the Northwest understand that. And if we don't continue to rise up against false solutions that our government is almost codifying into law that this is the way it should be, then we don't have any hope. And I'm going to stick with the hope that we can rise up, and that every seed we plant is a green seed towards the future for our children's children, because they will be still dealing with part of this legacy when we're gone.